Hey, John Fredericks Radio Network. Joining us now, my good friend Eddie Yeranian, voice of the Middle East. He's our man in the Middle East. Been with us for 8 years. Eddie, senior veteran radio correspondent, CBS News, Voice of America, and he's live in Cairo. Eddie, great to have you, man.
Thank you, John. I just listened to your interesting discussion about polls, and it kind of reminded me there's on YouTube an NBC night of the election discussion that goes for about 8 hours into the election of 1960. And you can see how they're trying to throw the election towards John F. Kennedy. Of course, I like John F. Kennedy, but anyway, that's still not the point. They were saying how their computer models were pointing to the fact that Kennedy was going to win because he won Connecticut. I'm from Connecticut, and I've never known Connecticut to be a bellwether state. But throughout the night, you watch them, and what they're ultimately trying to do is discourage the voters on the West Coast from turning out and voting, because by saying Kennedy has won the election, they caused all the supporters of Nixon on the West Coast, not all of them, but a lot of them, to stay home and not to vote. So people have been cheating for a long time. It's nothing new.
Well, thank you for pointing that out, and I actually do remember reading about that. I'm only 61, so 1960 I was only 3 years old, so I don't remember that. But I do remember my father telling me about that, and Nixon was a few points behind in California. He had run for governor there, and he was somewhat popular. That was a state that they were hoping to be competitive in, and they didn't get the turnout there in the urban, in the suburban areas with the traffic, because everybody was going home and listening to the radio or going on TV, and they had all heard that Kennedy was going to win easily, and so why bother? And this is where these fake polls, this is what they do. I mean, I saw it with my own eyes in 2016 right here in Virginia, where a poll comes out showing Trump at 27%, which was completely asinine. But our volunteer effort the week after that poll dropped down, 75%. Like, we couldn't get people to show up after that, because you're not going to work and give your time on a weekend when your candidate's at 27%. You're just not going to do it. I mean, I wouldn't do it. So I get that. I mean, I don't blame the volunteers. I blame them. And look, we're a lonely voice of the truth, you and I, Edward. So let's get to this Afghanistan Taliban meeting. Supposedly, the president arranged at Camp David in order to get the leaders of Afghanistan, and you can't not have the Taliban there. They are controlling a third of the country, and to try to get some kind of a peace agenda done. The Taliban, unbeknownst to any logic, kills a U.S. serviceman, 10 civilians, in order to gain leverage at the meeting. And the president promptly cancels it and says, I can't meet with people blowing up my troops. I mean, what is it that the Taliban wants here?
Well, I think it's what do their sponsors want more than what do they want. I think it's a group that's sponsored by various countries, by their intelligence services, and they're trying to manipulate, these countries are trying to manipulate the situation for various reasons. And no one really wants to have President Trump coming out with a diplomatic success before the elections in 2020. And I think anything he says, I'm just looking on Twitter at what the Washington Post writes, and I mean, it's pretty nauseating to watch this day in and day out. But they twist just about anything he says and does into a negative headline. So you come to the point where you ask yourself, are they reporting facts or information, or just spin and narrative? And that's pretty much what they're doing, spin and narrative. They've decided that they will spin everything and write a narrative that is negative to him no matter what he does. And that's what they would have done here, assuming he had come out with something of a success diplomatically. They would have spun it to the I don't know that they would have. I don't know how they were going to spin it, because I'm not inside their newsroom, but they would probably have found a narrative to say that he's pulling out, assuming that he had come up with a deal, and he's abandoning the country, and they would have written something negative about that too. So I don't think they want him to have a diplomatic success anyway. So you have to start out with that vision and that optic before analyzing what's actually going on in the ground.
Well, where do we go from here?
Well, I think NATO doesn't want us pulling out anyway. NATO has a mind of its own. We don't run NATO. Trump doesn't run NATO. NATO, a lot of countries there depend, well, I don't know a lot, but some countries depend on having money from this operation. There are reports, whether they're reliable or not, I haven't checked into them, that there's money going to drug smuggling. It's anyone's guess which parties are smuggling the drugs and who is doing it, but it's certainly being done under the cover of the NATO presence there in Afghanistan. And you have to ask yourself, well, why are we there? I mean, I don't hear any U.S. any mainstream networks asking the question, why are we there in the first place? I mean, it's always been, well, they attacked us at 9/11. Even 9/11 is sort of a hopeless morass as to what actually happened there. I think people are questioning what the real motivations were for that attack, who was behind it, who pulled the strings. And Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia is now coming under scrutiny. Saudi Arabia is coming under scrutiny, not because Saudi Arabia participated in this, but because people are trying to divide Saudi Arabia, I believe. I think this is just an effort to divide Saudi Arabia and bring it down politically because of the relative youth and, shall we say, incompetence, I don't know, you can call it what you like, of Mohammed bin Salman. But, I mean, they're taking advantage of it to weaken Saudi Arabia. And once again, I mean, you know, I'm not necessarily a big fan of Saudi Arabia, but I can see what they're trying to do.
Well, let me ask you this, Edward. We're with Eddie Yeranian. He's live in Cairo, senior correspondent, CBS News, Voice of America. So, Edward, the president now cancels the peace accord in Camp David, which, by the way, I thought was a brilliant idea. I mean, in order to get peace, you have to bring the parties together. And I said this story on the radio yesterday. Nobody criticized Jimmy Carter when he had Yasser Arafat come to Camp David with the president of Egypt. And, you know, Arafat back then had a pretty dark history of doing a lot of things that you wouldn't want to read to your Sunday school class. Okay, let's just leave it at that. So Arafat, not exactly the nicest guy in the world. We negotiated with Joseph Stalin after the Second World War. He killed 30 million of his own people. Not a very nice guy. I mean, sometimes you have to do things in order to bring peace. So I thought it was a good idea. And I get what you're saying. It's the sponsors of the Taliban is perhaps driving this. But like the president said, whether it's the sponsors or not, you really can't go forward with a negotiation when you can't even control what is happening in your factions. So I don't know where else the president can go now. You certainly can't meet with him. So
yeah,
right.
Yes, I think it's difficult to meet with them, and I think that a lot of those people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes don't want him to be able to pull the troops out, and they don't, as I said, don't want him to have any diplomatic success either before the 2020 election. But in terms of actually logistically withdrawing, there are countries that would like to see us bogged down there. They would like to see NATO bogged down there. And, I mean, the Taliban probably has a number of factions supported by one Gulf country, factions supported by another Gulf country, factions supported by Pakistan. Perhaps the Russians have their own branch. I've seen that rumored in the Arab media. So none of those countries would really like to see us pull out cleanly and get our troops out of there because they like to see us bogged down. They like to be able to pull our strings one way or the other, grab money from us because we have troops on the ground and don't really have any choice. So it's like squaring the circle. I mean, look how long Nixon had to work to pull the troops out of Vietnam. I mean, it was not an easy task, and that was clearly a losing venture, and it was clearly something that we were ultimately going to do, but pull out. And it took all of from 1968 and the 10th Offensive to 73 when they signed the accord. It took 5 years. How many people died unnecessarily in those 5 years? And this conflict has been raging since 2001. So that's 18 years. That's even longer.
Edward, let's shift gears a minute. Yesterday, two U.S. senators, Angus King of Maine, independent, caucuses with the Democrats, and Todd Young, Republican, both on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They sit down and have a meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. You know, same MBS that is allegedly was behind the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the horrible assassination of him. Same MBS that all the fake newsers around the country, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, all blasted the Trump administration for not sanctioning them or cutting them off. But now we have a Democratic senator meeting with him, and if you were to spend the next 5 hours scouring U.S. news, you couldn't find a single piece on it. So I guess if Trump engages with the Saudis and doesn't cancel deals based on it, somehow he's incompetent. But when one of their Democratic caucus members, Angus King, goes to meet with MBS, that's fine. Is there hypocrisy that I smell or not?
Yeah, I think the entire American political system reeks of hypocrisy. I think it always has. We just probably were too young to know about it or understand it, and it's just becoming more obvious to us because we've been watching these things for a long time. And also because there are a lot more available media outlets to see these things on. I mean, a lot more information gets out, even though the mainstream media puts out fake news and doesn't give us all the facts and information. It's still getting out there through Twitter, through all sorts of other sources. So yes, I think you're right.
Eddie, Yeranian Live, Cairo. Thanks for being with us. Great analysis as always, Ed. You're the best. Been with us for 8 years on the John Fredericks Show. Ed, so great to talk to you every Tuesday. Have a great day. Thank you.
My pleasure, John.